They say history is written by the victors, but what if those victors feared a carpenter more than an empire? Before we begin this journey into betrayal, power, and prophecy, take a moment, subscribe to this channel, and activate the bell. What you're about to uncover is not just a story, it's the foundation of a faith, the echo of a crucifixion, and the unraveling of two men who thought they had silenced eternity. This is not ancient history. It's a mirror of ambition, of fear, of the price we pay when we manipulate truth to protect power. Stay with me, because what Annas and Caiaphas unleashed in secret chambers still reshapes the world today. Let's begin. Jerusalem didn't sleep under Roman rule. It endured. Every dawn, behind its sacred walls, a new kind of tension brewed. Not the tension of swords or soldiers, but of silence, of whispered names. And no names were spoken with more fear or more reverence than Annas and Caiaphas. They weren't kings, but their word weighed heavier than steel. These men didn't command armies. They commanded the sacred, and that made them untouchable. Or so they believed. Annas, the aging high priest with eyes like flint, had built his empire not with violence, but with strategy. Decades earlier, he'd secured his throne by placing his sons, and his son-in-law, into the very heart of the temple's machinery. Caiaphas, younger, colder, was the blade Annas wielded from behind velvet curtains. Together, they were more than religious leaders. They were gatekeepers of tradition, curators of fear. But no kingdom, not even a spiritual one, stands unchallenged forever. From the wind-scattered hills of Galilee, a voice began to rise. Not a voice that shouted, but one that healed, one that forgave. And in that forgiveness, there was rebellion. His name was Jesus. To most, a prophet. To some, a Messiah. To Annas and Caiaphas, a threat. He didn't dress like a priest, didn't beg for favor. He walked barefoot through marketplaces, turning eyes and hearts with the weight of his words. "Blessed are the meek," he said. In a city ruled by pride, that wasn't just doctrine, it was dynamite. People followed, crowds gathered, and fear crept into the corridors of power. Annas watched the momentum shift. He felt it in the tremble of temple donations, in the shifting loyalties of merchants who once bowed to his name. Caiaphas, calculating as ever, didn't panic. He planned. Because this wasn't just heresy, it was disruption. And in every society, disruption demands control. Immediate, total, permanent. What would you do if your dynasty, built over decades, was threatened by a carpenter from Nazareth? If everything you'd sacrificed to build was unraveling by the hands of one man and his ragtag disciples, you'd strike. But not with swords, with strategy, with silence, with betrayal. And that's how it began. In rooms scented with oil and parchment, where decisions were made with nods, not votes, where a whisper could condemn a soul, they would stop him. For the good of the people, they told themselves, for the protection of the temple, for God. But deep down, they weren't saving anyone. They were saving themselves. The temple, towering and resplendent, wasn't just a house of worship. It was a marketplace, a currency exchange, a monument to power disguised as piety. And Annas ruled over it like a monarch. Every dove sold, every coin exchanged, fed his empire. He had transformed sacred ground into profit, masking greed as order, disguising extortion as devotion. Caiaphas upheld it, not because he believed in the system, but because the system believed in him. Rome tolerated their rituals as long as they kept peace, and Caiaphas was very good at keeping peace, especially when it was stained in silence. He knew the balance: pacify the people, flatter the empire, and crush anything that smelled of revolt. And then Jesus walked into the temple. He didn't walk quietly. He stormed in, eyes blazing, hands gripping a whip fashioned from rope. Tables flew, coins clattered, animals fled, and silence broke into chaos. "You've turned my father's house into a den of thieves," he thundered. Not whispered, thundered. That moment wasn't a protest. It was war, and everyone watching knew it. That single act didn't just offend, it exposed. It laid bare the corruption rotting behind the incense in scriptures, and worst of all, it reminded people they had a voice, that maybe holiness couldn't be bought, that maybe God wasn't locked behind walls but walking among them. To Annas and Caiaphas, it wasn't blasphemy. It was rebellion, and rebellions had consequences. If you've ever felt silenced, overlooked, or underestimated, understand this. The most dangerous force in the world isn't violence. It's truth, because once people taste it, they can't unsee it. And Annas and Caiaphas knew if they didn't kill the truth would kill their power. Power never falls overnight. It collapses piece by piece under the weight of truths ignored for too long. Annas felt that weight, not in public but in private, where his advisors spoke with urgency and fear. Reports came daily. More crowds, more miracles, more whispers of Messiah. And he knew something Rome didn't. That revolutions in Judea didn't start with swords. They started with hope. Hope was the contagion. And Jesus was patient zero. In his quarters lined with scrolls and gold, Annas listened as informants recited every word the Galilean spoke. He heals on the Sabbath. He forgives sins without sacrifice. He speaks as if he's above the law. And Annas's knuckles whitened around the arms of his chair. This wasn't just radical. It was dismantling centuries of control. Meanwhile, Caiaphas played the longer game. He didn't want just a conviction. He wanted justification. So he gathered scribes, Pharisees, strategists, men who could trap Jesus in words, make him stumble publicly. They launched questions like arrows. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Who is your authority? And every time Jesus answered, not with defense, but with clarity that disarmed. They couldn't out-talk him. They couldn't outmaneuver him. And so, the plan shifted. A secret meeting. A deal made. A man named Judas, once trusted, now twisted. The price? 30 silver coins. Not for information, but for a kiss. A kiss that would lead soldiers into shadows, that would hand truth over to fear. History repeats because fear never dies. It only changes masks. And in that upper chamber of strategy, fear wore robes. It spoke in holy language, but its heartbeat was panic. Panic that they were losing control. Panic that the man from Galilee was telling the people they never needed them to reach God. The night of betrayal wasn't marked by war cries. It was marked by silence. Gethsemane wasn't a battlefield. It was a garden, and in its shadows, betrayal bloomed. Judas approached, lips trembling, heart fractured, and kissed the teacher he once called Lord. The soldiers didn't hesitate. They seized Jesus like a criminal, though he raised no hand, no resistance, just prophecy unfolding, breath by breath. The disciples scattered. Fear always outruns faith when the cost becomes real. They dragged Jesus first to Annas, not to the temple, not to the court, to a house, private, controlled. The official high priest was Caiaphas, but everyone knew. Annas still pulled the strings, and he wanted the first word, the first look, the first crack in the stone. What is your doctrine? He demanded. But Jesus didn't plead. He didn't negotiate. He said what every abuser of power fears. Ask those who heard me. I've spoken openly. Truth, simple and defiant. So one of the guards struck him across the face. But power doesn't reside in fists. It lives in the refusal to break. Annas found no confession, no stumble, only unwavering resolve. So he sent Jesus on, bound, marked, but not defeated, to Caiaphas, to the next chamber of injustice. The plan was in motion. The machinery of death was turning, and no one could stop it, except, perhaps, the very one they were trying to silence. Caiaphas didn't want justice. He wanted finality. So he called the Sanhedrin, not in daylight, as law required, but in the dead of night, cloaked, illegal. They weren't seeking truth. They were building a noose. Testimonies clashed. Stories fell apart. But eventually, two voices echoed the same tale. He said he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Caiaphas stood, pushed forward, eyes burning. Are you the Messiah, the Son of God? And in that moment, silence fell. Jesus looked at him, past him, through him, and spoke words that shattered the room. You have said so, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven. That was it. The line. The moment the old world snapped. Caiaphas tore his robe. Not from grief, but from triumph. He had what he wanted. A confession. A claim to divinity. Blasphemy. Enough to condemn. Enough to kill. The room roared. Fists clenched. Spit flew. And the man who healed the blind was now blindfolded and beaten. "Prophesy," they jeered. "Tell us who hit you." The Lion of Judah, mocked by jackals. But here's the truth the powerful always forget. Crucifying truth doesn't bury it. It resurrects it. The sun would rise soon. And when it did, Rome would be summoned. Because under Roman law, only they could authorize death. And now, Annas and Caiaphas needed a new mask. They had secured a religious charge. But Rome wouldn't kill for theology. They would kill for treason. And so, the script would be rewritten. The Messiah, no longer a blasphemer, now a revolutionary, a threat to Caesar, a danger to empire. But the true danger had always been this. He made people believe they were already free. The courtyard smelled of oil and ash. As dawn crept over Jerusalem, Pilate's guards readied the praetorium for yet another judgment. But this wasn't just another prisoner. This wasn't a zealot or a thief. This was a man whose presence stirred riots without raising a sword. And behind him, in the shadows, stood Annas and Caiaphas, hands clean, robes spotless, but blood already on their lips. They hadn't killed him, not directly, but they'd orchestrated it like a symphony. Every note, every lie, perfectly placed. And now, they only needed Rome to strike the final chord. Pilate was no fool. He'd governed long enough to smell political manipulation. When they brought Jesus to him, they changed their tone. No longer blasphemy, now treason. He claims to be king, they said. He forbids tribute to Caesar. They needed Rome to see a rebel, not a rabbi. But Pilate saw through it. "What accusation do you bring?" he asked. They deflected. If he weren't a criminal, we wouldn't have brought him. It wasn't an answer. It was a trap. In private, Pilate questioned Jesus. "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered not with defense, but with paradox. "My kingdom is not of this world." Pilate was unsettled. This man didn't beg, didn't curse. He spoke with weight, but not ambition. And that terrified Pilate more than any sword. When he returned to the priests, he declared, "I find no fault in him." But they pressed harder, shouting, threatening unrest. And in the distance, the people began to gather. Annas and Caiaphas had expected resistance. They'd also prepared for it, stirred the crowds, infiltrated the square with voices loud enough to echo rage. It wasn't justice, it was theater. A production directed with precision. And when Pilate, in one last gesture of mercy, offered the release of a prisoner for Passover, the choice was laid bare. Jesus or Barabbas, a healer or a killer. And yet the people, stirred into frenzy, shouted for Barabbas. It wasn't reason, it was momentum. And momentum, once unleashed, devours everything in its path. Pilate washed his hands, a symbolic gesture, empty of power, drenched in cowardice. He handed Jesus over to be scourged, tortured, and executed, not because he believed it was right, but because peace, for him, was more valuable than justice. And as soldiers mocked the king of the Jews, placing a crown of thorns on his brow, Annas and Caiaphas withdrew, not to pray, but to prepare, because their victory was near, or so they thought. Outside the city walls, a hill awaited. Golgotha, a place of death, of spectacle. Jesus, barely alive, carried his own cross. Blood-soaked, broken, yet silent. Not a single curse, not a plea, just resolve. They nailed him through bone, raised him above the crowd, and still he forgave. Still he loved. For Annas and Caiaphas, it should have ended there, with silence, with the image of another rebel erased by empire. But instead, the earth shook. Darkness fell. At noon, the sky turned black as night. The veil in the temple tore in two, from top to bottom. And for those with eyes to see, it was more than weather. It was a rupture, a divine scream, a warning. And at the foot of the cross, a Roman centurion whispered what the priests refused to admit. Truly, this was the Son of God. It wasn't just a death, it was a declaration, and no amount of denial could undo it. Back in the temple, the sacrifices continued. Lambs were slain, blood collected, rituals repeated. But something had shifted, a tremor beneath tradition, a quiet panic beneath the chants. Annas felt it. Caiaphas feared it. Because while the world moved on, they knew, deep in their marrow, that something irreversible had occurred. The man they had tried to silence was speaking louder than ever, not with words, but with wounds, and the echo would never die. The tomb was sealed, the stone rolled tight, Roman guards stationed like statues. Annas and Caiaphas had done everything right, every law twisted, every bribe paid, every risk managed. To them, it was over. The threat was buried, silence restored, and Passover could resume with the illusion of order intact. But in their quiet halls, unease slithered like smoke, because dead men don't inspire fear, unless you're afraid they weren't just men. They had remembered his words. On the third day, I will rise. That prophecy, that haunting whisper, had stuck. And now, like men drowning in their own schemes, they raced to plug the cracks. They asked Pilate for extra security, a Roman seal, a stone no human could move. But what they truly feared couldn't be stopped by soldiers. It wasn't theft they were afraid of, it was resurrection. Because if he returned, nothing would hold. And when the morning broke on that third day, the world shifted. The tomb was open, the body gone. Soldiers trembled, women ran, and what Annas and Caiaphas had spent years building unraveled in minutes. They paid off the guards, spread lies, spun stories. But truth has a way of bleeding through, even when wrapped in fear. And from that empty grave, a fire spread, one they could no longer contain. They had tried to kill a man. Instead, they birthed a movement, one not rooted in rebellion, but in grace, not in power, but in love. And every time someone whispered his name in faith, every time a life was changed by his story, Annas and Caiaphas lost again. They became footnotes in the very story they tried to erase. And while their palaces crumbled, his kingdom grew, without swords, without silver, without walls. In the years that followed, persecution would rage, Rome would burn, temples would fall, but the story of Jesus would remain, etched not in stone, but in hearts. And the names of Annas and Caiaphas? Shadows, reminders, proof that no amount of status, wealth, or influence can bury truth for long. The irony is sharp. In trying to silence him, they amplified him. In trying to erase him, they carved him into eternity. And now, centuries later, their legacy is dust, while his words still rise in every corner of the world. The man they mocked, judged, and pierced is worshipped, loved, followed, not because of what he escaped, but because of what he endured. And in every act of mercy, every sacrifice made in his name, the judgment falls, not on him, but on those who feared the light more than the darkness. You've followed this story to its final breath. And if it moved you, stirred something in your spirit, don't let it stop here. Subscribe, share this truth, speak it. Because truth, once awakened, cannot be ignored. This isn't history, it's now. And you, yes you, are part of it. Be bold, be unshakable. Let your voice rise like his did, not in anger, but in undeniable, unstoppable truth.